welcome to Spacefaring Civilization, a place where us filmmakers help each other create optimistic sci-fi, which inspires a better future. So today I'm joined by Nicholas.
Hi.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to come and talk to us. So Nicholas is an award-winning filmmaker from Melbourne, Australia, a wonderful, wonderful city.
Thank you. Love it very much.
We love it too. Nicholas has credits for films, short films, and commercials. And today he's going to be talking about and giving us some hints and tips on how to improve our scripts, especially our short film scripts for the SFC writing contest, by designing a protagonist journey.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, by the way. It's wonderful to have you here.
Me.
Yeah. So before we get started, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I went to university at RMIT. I did a media studies course. And
so RMIT is
Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Yeah. I don't even know if they still use that full version, but it's definitely RMIT. We can safely say that.
Yep.
And the course that I did doesn't actually exist anymore. I think they've gotten more specific with what they do.
Yep.
But it was fairly general, and I bounced around then to a bunch of different small production companies and whatnot.
Yep.
And then I worked for a while project managing the creation of DVDs and Blu-rays for a bunch of big clients. And then moved with my girlfriend up to Sydney so that she could study. And while I was there, I met a lot of really talented writers and filmmakers. And I wrote and directed 2 of the shorts that I've made and that have since gone on to win awards. And I also made my first feature film.
Tell us about that.
It's funny. I was thinking about it today, coming on talking about optimistic sci-fi, because it's about the least optimistic film you could probably get to. It's an incredibly bleak film. It's about.
But we can still learn from it, right?
Absolutely. Well, I learned a lot from it. I'll tell you that. But it's about a nuclear attack in Sydney and a group of people who survive in an underground bunker. Mm-hmm. And it's called 54 Days. And we made that back in 2014 for less than 100,000. And it was an incredible experience. I think the film has its flaws, but the things I learned were just astronomical, you know, and working with everyone and actually delivering something and then getting to see it play at an audience for an audience. We traveled to the States for it and won some awards while we were there. So it was a really incredible experience.
Well, walk us through it then. What do we need to consider when designing a hero's journey, and what processes do we go through?
Yeah,
and I know you're going to talk in general, but maybe just point out the bits that we can incorporate in our short films.
Absolutely. The other thing to remember is that everyone's got a different process, right? So the way I'm talking is about the way that I would approach building and designing a character journey. And some other people might come at it from a slightly different thing, but the concepts are all still the same. So the hero's journey, God, I'll try to recite it, but you know, it's split in film, we split it into 3 acts because of the way that the energy shifts in the story. But it may even be helpful to think about it in 4 acts, because I also include, which is not in the 12-step hero's journey that a lot of people talk about. I believe that what is crucial is a beat in the middle called the midpoint, or the midpoint reversal, where we kind of have a false victory. Which is really important for the way that characters approach their goals.
Is that to show the growth of the character?
Yeah, it's because this would take forever if we go through all the details. Yeah. So let's talk about that specifically. The way a character, every story is, there's a character who is happy or content with the status quo. And something upsets that status quo. Mm-hmm. And what they want to begin with is for everything to go back the way it was.
Yeah.
And they spend time and energy trying to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, which is generally our midpoint reversal, it becomes clear that they are not going to be able to do that. That things cannot go back the way that they were. And they might continue to fight that, or they might give in to that, but that takes us to what I think is the beating heart of the story, and this is where I would start developing my story and my character's journey, is what's known as the ordeal. You know, people call it the dark night of the soul, whatever it is. It's the moment where our character faces their fear, overcomes their flaw, and from there they now have the energy and power and ideas and weapons or whatever it is that happens to now go back and defeat the thing that was upsetting the status quo, and they've reset and started a new status quo. And that's the story, right? Like, character, status quo, that gets upset. They really want things to go back to normal because that would be easiest for them. And we know for conflict, nothing can be easy for our character, so we're going to resist that, and then ultimately they're going to have to face the thing that's holding them back, and then create a new status quo, and life can go on. And so one of the things we touched on there is the ordeal, and the way that I develop basically anything that I write, and this would apply for shorts and features, is once I have a concept, I'm like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if we did a story about people traveling to Mars, okay? Well, the first thing that's so vague and so much could happen, that the first thing that I would start thinking about is, what do I want to say with this film, right? Like I would say, what is there to be said to the world that I think is a truth that might be worth saying to the world, that could be expressed with a journey to Mars. And I might want to say something like, it doesn't matter where you go, home is where the heart is, right? Like maybe that's what it is, right? Yeah. So once I have that concept where I'm like, that is what is essentially the theme, but it is the heart of the concept. And so we would take that and we would look at how to create a character who needs to learn this thing. That is ultimately something they don't believe at the beginning. They may have believed it once and they have since been taught not to, and they need to be reminded of it, or they may have never believed it about the world. So we know first thing is this person, this protagonist, has lived a life that has taught them the opposite of what the film is going to teach them. So that we've got a bit of backstory happening. And then the way that these big lessons get taught to our characters is through painful lessons, right? That we call them wounds or flaws. And these are things that just absolutely inform the way our characters interact, And so if it was something like home is where the heart is, and I'm spitballing here and it may not be the best version of it, but let's say, this might be a character who just does not have connection to people, just refuses to put down roots anywhere. That flaw is going to influence the way that they live their whole life and the status quo that they begin with at the beginning of the story. And we need to, as writers, artificially wrap that in a flaw. And what that means is, if we're thinking about something like backstory, we need to figure out a situation that would teach someone that lesson, that home is not where the heart is, and what that might be is something like neglectful parents or something like that, that at some point the situation is that the idea of familial love and the idea of any particular home has been ripped apart and disconnected from one another, and that is now something that they believe, and that of course is going to grow into all these other things that are fun to write about for your character, which is they've got trust issues or abandonment issues or half a dozen other things. You would invent a specific scenario where the character learns the thing that you need them to believe in the beginning of the story. And into that scenario, you need to build a fear. the way we're going to communicate this huge concept to our audience is we're going to have a character who doesn't believe it, and then hidden in their greatest fear, deep under the ocean, they're going to have to go there.
So they have to overcome that.
They're going to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And then once they're there, they will overcome this flaw. It'll be at that point in the story that the character realizes that the things that I love are around me, are the family that I've built, whatever it is. And there's this great thing, the next beat in the hero's journey after the ordeal is the reward. And the reward is one of the very few times outside of the call to adventure that you as a writer are kind of allowed to break the rules of writing, and you can't ruin the world that you've created, but you are allowed to go in and the audience will let you just give the character what they need. I would construct where the character begins. That's our first act. Yeah. And what we know is our call to adventure, which happens in the middle of our first act, has to challenge the character's flaw. Okay? And we know that the flaw because we've already built that flaw. And the reason that's important is that if they got called to adventure and it wasn't connected to their flaw, and their flaw wasn't shielded by their greatest fear, well, it'd be easy to fix, wouldn't it? You go like, okay, cool, no worries. Like, I'm not afraid of anything here, and that's not a problem. I'll just go and do that thing, and we're all good. But they can't, because we've built this thing that, like, they just can't get through that fear yet, and that sets us off. So I would build the ordeal. That's the end of our second act. I would build the opening of the film, the first act, because that's usually fairly easy. And then I would build our midpoint, which is from the end of the first act, our character is going to be pursuing a goal. Sometimes they get the thing that they were questing for, but they haven't finished their internal arc. So say something goes wrong, and now maybe there's a new goal set up. The one that I'm thinking of for that is like Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Like middle of the film, they get the arc, but then the Nazis take it and they get trapped underground. And now we're off on the second half of the story. We've got to get it back. Or the other one is, and I find this a very effective one, is it's a false goal. It's the thing they think they needed, and they go and get it, and it hasn't fixed the problem. And the important part of this beat is that once they get the thing, everything goes wrong. The bottom drops out, and things are bad, and they get worse for a while because the thing that they achieved isn't the thing that they needed to achieve ultimately, You have to have this like dual thought process going on of like, what is real and consistent in my story, but also I am the God creator of the world that we're telling the story about. And so I need to be able to juggle things like, I can't give this character what they want because I still haven't taught them the lesson they need to learn, And from there, like, I've got the ordeal, which is the point of the story. I've got the opening of the story, which is what challenges my character's flaw. They're too afraid to face it. They meet a mentor who says, come on, we can figure this out. And then they go off in search of something, and then that turns out not to be the thing that they need, and then they have to go and get the thing that they need. And all of a sudden, we've built sort of 2/3 of our character journey. And then the hardest two parts, as far as I'm concerned, for writing, they're usually the most fun parts to write. But it's the beginning of Act 2 up to the midpoint, because the false goal is a tricky thing to figure out. Often it's hard. If they're going after the real goal, it's much easier to understand how the stakes play into it, how the villain is maybe going, or the antagonist is trying to stop them from that. But the false goal is a bit harder to make work, and it's hard to keep your character moving proactively towards that. And I understand that, and I struggle with it. And I think that when people talk about the second act being a difficult act to write, that's what they're talking about, is like juggling what to do in that space. And there's not a lot of writing there's some good stuff about like the sequence approach and stuff that fills in some of that. But there's not a lot of writing and there's not a lot said in the hero's journey about what to do in that bit and how that bit functions. In the hero's journey, it's described as tests, allies, and enemies, which is so broad. It's like, okay, they meet some people, I guess, and like some stuff happens to them, but it's like, but what, you know? And so that's tricky. And Blake Snyder describes it as fun and games, which what he says is like, this is where most of the trailer stuff is going to come from, because it's not giving anything away, but it's all the best and most fun stuff, because the bad stuff hasn't really started happening yet, you know? They're useful things to keep in mind, because we know it's got to do all of that. But I do think that practically what you need to do is character needs to be pursuing the false goal or the midpoint goal from wherever they are in Act 1. And then your climax is always, I find, really difficult to write as well. I think a lot of people approach the story having that in mind, and I think that that's great if that's how you begin your story. But I always find that difficult because I think that the most important thing in the story is the character overcoming their flaw. I always find it hard to write something compelling after that, because I'm like, but they've already learned the thing that they needed to learn, you know, and now they just have to do the thing that the story has been leading them to, you know. I don't know. I guess what that's saying to me is that the inner conflict really drives my engagement with a story, and that the outer conflict by that stage feels a little bit superfluous. But the beautiful thing about the story is that once you're in it, you're not thinking about it analytically like this. You're just engaged. Like I'm thinking of like Star Wars, right? Like where the third act is like, we got to blow up the Death Star, and you're just on the edge of your seat for the whole thing because it's so exciting and so engaging. But like Luke has pretty much done what he needed to do, and he's going to have one. This is another thing that I think is not written down a lot, but there's always going to be one final test during the resurrection where they're going to be tested on, did you really learn the lesson that you think you've learned? Like, you know, and Luke hears Obi-Wan and he turns the computer off and he is able to do it, you know, like, did you really learn it? You know, like, did you take it on board? And that always happens. There's always going to be that beat in the climax, you know, where there's one final test of like, did you get it? So yeah, that is how I would build a character's journey.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Condensing that down to
For a short film.
a short film is really, really tricky. Now we're doing
We're still going to have the 3 acts, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you're going to have a beginning and a middle and an end. So you can't escape the fact that there are going to be 3 parts to your movie. When you're writing a feature, the people talk about there should be 25 pages in Act 1. There should be, 60 to 90 pages in Act 2, or whatever it is, and there should be 25 pages in Act 3. And you never need to stick to these page counts precisely, but what that tells you is if you've got a 60-page Act 1, your pacing might be off. They're diagnostic tools that you can go back. And the tricky thing about a short is that you maybe don't have the time to be like, I'm going to spend this long on each of the acts. Your Act 1 might be 20 seconds long, because once the character commits to whatever it is that they need to do in the story, we're in Act 2, and then the whole thing might be basically Act 2 until 12 seconds before the end, or you might have a much more traditional thing where you go like a minute, 3 minutes, a minute, who knows. But that's part of the problem of translating. Now we're doing the screen camera accelerated TV pod, and there's a writer in that called Erin Foy that I produced and directed a short film she wrote. And the objective of that, this was for a Tropfest short, the objective for that was, I'm going to write a story that does the whole hero's journey in 7 pages. And she worked really, really hard, and it was really, really hard work. And she knows the hero's journey back to front. And it was tricky to get it all in there. So I think that it's possible to do. And that was really good because, you can start to see the pieces as they work. It's a stripped down version of the journey, and there might only be one beat for each moment. But you can do it. What often helps, or what often works really nicely, and the way that I think I would approach, because I would still want to build a character with a flaw and a fear, right? And I would start there, and that's kind of our theme. So I would build from a thematic point of view. I would start the story as close to possible in a situation where they don't want to face their fear and they're going to have to, and they will learn a lesson. Yeah, and then you're going to need to show us a scene where they use the knowledge that they've since learned. And that's kind of how I would maybe approach the short structure. Is and here's the other tricky thing: they've got to have a goal. So they've got a goal, they've got a fear and the thing that they don't want to deal with. They've got a goal. They pursue the goal to the point where they face the fear, and then whatever they learn from that, they then apply to their world. And that's kind of how I would approach. Then the problem you've got is we're talking optimistic sci-fi, right? So like, how do you tell a very optimistic story that at its core is about fear and flaws, right?
No, you can still do that, but the tone is optimistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So an example I can give, so Enemy Mine, there is, I don't know if you've seen it, and I don't know if the audience have seen it, but it very much has those fears, and so they were fearing each other as enemies, but by the end of it, not only they were friends, they were actually family.
Yeah.
So that's the optimistic part of it.
And the flaw that's definitely inherent in that is going to be a prejudice, right? It's going to be a xenophobia and a prejudice, and that is what the character is going to need to face. And I think that one of the things that makes optimistic sci-fi really work is that ending. You've got to get that ending right, where the thing that they learn is the optimistic thing. It's the thing that you as a writer believe would make the world better if everyone knew this, because there are films out there where the point is, power corrupts, nobody cares about each other. And, you can make a convincing film about that, but when we're talking about optimistic sci-fi, I think ultimately the character needs to learn something that you as a writer and a filmmaker believe would make the world better, would improve the world, which is why so often it is about family and acceptance and love, because these are things that it would be hard for anyone to argue are negative things, these are universal truths that we all agree, if we could all be a little bit better in these things, the world itself would be immeasurably better. And so I think that's hugely important, that I think that you build that flaw. The thing the character needs to learn is the thing that you want the world to learn, about being better and growing into a nicer, safer, sweeter place,
Well, thank you very much for
no worries.
all those wonderful words of wisdom. I think we've learned a lot. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in below. And if you have a specific question of Nicholas, also put it in below, and I'll pass it on to Nicholas, if you don't mind.
Great.
Thank you so much. So thank you for
your
time.
Thank you so much. Cheers,
all right. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.